Hey, Melissa. I'm so happy that we were able to connect today. And I guess we can just jump right in. Why don't you start off by telling us your near-death experience story?
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's great to connect with you again. So, I should I should qualify and say I didn't die, so I don't know if it would technically be a near-death experience, but I refer to it as a near-death-like experience or a spiritually transformative experience because it had so many of the same elements. So, a little bit of background, I was very let's just say I had a rough time emotionally as a child, and there's some different reasons for that, which we might get into later on in this interview. But I was very depressed for most of my childhood and as a teenager. And I was also like deeply seeking a divine connection. And I was raised in the Christian faith, so I would pray every night before I went to bed. Please let me experience your presence. I want to feel that blissful divine presence that I knew was available, but I didn't know how to connect to it. And so I would just pray every single night for some kind of supernatural experience. And it never happened up until the night that it did. And I can't really explain why, it happened that night, except maybe it was just the right time. I didn't do anything extra to trigger it. So I was just laying in my bed praying for an experience, praying to feel God's presence. And I was fully awake, but my eyes were closed. And suddenly I was in another dimension. It's hard to describe because I can't say it was another place, because in an experience like this, things like space and time don't exist in the same way. So there were two portions to my experience. In the first one, I still perceived myself to be laying in my bed in my room. But suddenly it was like I was in another dimension or another realm, like a higher dimension where I could sense other things. And it felt like I was laying in an ocean of love, and I could feel waves of love washing over my entire body from my feet to my head and also washing through me. And as those waves of love washed through me, it wiped away all the pain of my life in an instant. So I'll try to describe what this love felt like. It felt like being in a magnetic force field of love that was also an ocean of love because it was moving like waves. And it was also a presence. So it was very personal. It was like you could say it was a being. There was somebody there. And I recognized this presence as something that I had known before this life, that I've been taught in this life to call God. But God is a very limiting word. So the way that I experienced this love was it was as if it was all the loves that you could ever know or experience in this lifetime. So male, female, father, mother, brother, sister, best friend, pet, lover, parent, everything all rolled into one. And this is where words fail me because there are no words to describe this. So I'm left with saying things like, imagine all the love that you ever experienced multiplied by a million. And then add to that peace and joy and bliss and safety and the deepest security that you could ever imagine feeling that you've never felt in this life. And add to that math and music and geometry and laughter and like put all of this together and you might begin to comprehend what this felt like. But it felt like I was being nurtured in my eternal mother's womb and held in my eternal father's arms at the same time. And the overriding feeling that I had was, I am so safe and secure. There is nothing that could ever hurt me. And this was really meaningful for me because I was taught that most of the world's population is going to burn in hell forever. And it just became instantly clear to me that this idea was laughable, that this thing that we call God is so big, just so big and so far beyond anything that we could ever do, and that everything is safely and securely held. And the idea of somebody being eternally lost in the face of that magnificent of a presence is just ridiculous. So I experienced all this as I still perceived myself to be in my room, um and this all happened very fast. It takes time to explain it, but it was just like these instantaneous realizations. And so I said to this presence, "Where have you been my entire life? I've been looking for you my entire life, and now you're finally here." And I didn't really get an answer to that question, but I just I remember feeling like, "Okay, I can stay here forever. This is it. I'm not going back to my life." I would have been happy to have stayed there, soaking in that love forever. So at some point, that portion of my experience ended, and the second portion began. And what happened is that my consciousness began expanding out of my body. And this part actually gets really tricky to describe because time was completely different. So it's like all of these things are happening at the same time. So it's like it's this whole experience, and yet it's these other experiences. And it's like, on the one hand, it happened really fast, and then on the other hand, I had all this different these different things with all this detail going on. So I'll do my best to describe it in a way that makes sense. So I began expanding out of my head, and first, I'll describe what the expansion process felt like. So there's two ways I can describe this. The first way I can describe this is that I felt like I was expanding through dimensional awareness. So if you think about like how first dimension would just be a point, second dimension would just be a line, third dimension would be um or no, I guess the 0 dimension would be the point, the first dimension would be the line, the second dimension would be the square, and the third dimension would be a cube. And as you go up, it's like this huge expansion every time, and it can hold so much more information. That's what it felt like, except I was going up into higher dimensions. And every time I would break through into a higher dimension, it was like the amount of information that I had access to increased exponentially. And also, there's this feeling of freedom and release, and like being able to expand and spread out. And so I don't know exactly how many dimensions I went up. I just know that this process repeated several times. And when I got to the top, I could look down, and I'll come back to this with more detail in a minute, but I could look down and I could see everything that exists in our reality, and I could see the whole cosmic master plan of God, which is the word that I was given as a Christian teen. That meant something to me at that time, but I know it sounds really cheesy. The other way I can describe this expansion process is that as soon as I came out of my head, I realized that I had access to information. And near-death experiencers, I learned later, call this ultimate knowledge, an experience of ultimate knowledge, where all of a sudden I just knew I can have any question answered that I want. And so I began asking this presence every question that I could think of. And I don't remember, I know I asked about if evolution or creation was true, because that was a huge thing for me at the time. I don't remember most of what I asked, but I do remember that when I would ask a question, I would get this huge download of information of the answer to that question and how that answer fit in with literally everything else in the universe. And so now I can explain it because we have computers. It's like getting this massive download of information is exactly what it felt like. And And so every time, and this was happening at the speed of light, because every time I would get a download, it would trigger more questions for me. And so then I would ask more questions and get the answers to those questions and how those answers fit in with everything else in the universe. And then at some point, like I said before, I got to the top of whatever it was possible for me to know at that level. And I felt like I knew everything that there is to know, and everything in the universe is happening within me. So that's what the process felt like. So I'll pause there and then I'll explain some of the things that I saw that I remember. So the first thing that I remember being aware of is I felt like I was waking up out of a dream. When I came out of my body, I felt like I was waking up out of a nightmare and I was remembering the real world. So that's exactly what it felt like. And the real world that I woke up into was brilliant, like blindingly brilliant light. And I was surrounded by I wasn't given a name for them, but we would call them angels or guides, the beings that were invested in helping me through this life. And I remember being met with so much love and acceptance and awakening to the realization that I had not done anything wrong. And this is the message I was given. You have nothing to feel guilty about. You have nothing to feel ashamed for. You have nothing to be afraid of. There is no punishment awaiting you. Your life is proceeding exactly as it is supposed to. Even though you're going through some really difficult things, it is proceeding exactly as it was planned, and it is okay. You have nothing to worry about. You are doing an amazing job, and we support you, and we are so proud of you. And it is impossible for anybody to ever be eternally lost. Everybody will wake up to this love when they pass on. There is judgment is not awaiting anybody. And then I looked down on the earth and I experienced how God, or how source, whatever word you're comfortable with, sees us. And I saw that the world is full of the same brilliant light that I was experiencing in this other place. Everything is made of the same light, and the light is the love of God, or the arms of God holding us. And it is impossible for us to get away from that, because that's what we are. And I also saw that, and I'm using the word God because that's what was meaningful for me at the time. Being a Christian and being taught that God is this angry, vengeful monster that's going to throw people in hell. And then I was being shown, no, God is this. God is like a loving grandfather who understands that his grandchildren are just learning to walk. And why would he get angry because they stumble and fall? That's the example that I was given. And I just saw that we are all so securely held and loved, and there's nothing that can ever change that, no matter what we do. Another analogy that I like to use to describe this part of the experience is that if you have ever flown on an airplane on a cloudy day, so when you start off the journey, it's cloudy and gloomy, and then you break up above the clouds and it becomes, I mean, you can see the sun and it's like, oh, the sun was here the whole time. So that's what this experience was like. It was like coming up out of the pain and the misery that I was experiencing in this life and waking up to the ultimate reality that everything is okay and everything is beautiful. Actually, the sun is shining, but then you look down and you see that the storm clouds are only an illusion that can be experienced from below. They're not actually there. Everything is actually brilliant light. So that was the first thing that I remember. The other thing that I remember in detail is when I got to the top. There's two things I saw when I got to the top. The first one was that I was shown the secret to life. I do not remember that. I wish I could. I just remember getting all the way to the top and oh yeah, okay, this is what it's all about. It's so simple. How do we complicate it so much? And it made so much sense to me. And it's like I remembered everything. Like why we come to earth, why we suffer, why people do bad things. And it was all this really simple answer that I can't remember anymore. But I do remember knowing when I was given this answer that I would not be able to remember it. Not because it was being taken from me or my mind was being wiped or anything like that, but just because I was in such a higher dimensional space that it is impossible for us to hold that amount of information in our denser plane here, if that makes sense. So that was one thing I saw. The other thing that I alluded to earlier is that I looked down and I saw the master plan. I saw in vivid color and detail, I saw this beautiful Mandela pattern that was alive, moving, shifting, multidimensional, very colorful. And it was like when you see those old, rugs that people used to knit, I think, and then on the one side, it would look really messy on the back, but on the other side, it would be this beautiful pattern. And so what I saw is that from our perspective, things look like they are a mess down here. But actually, from the higher perspective, it is this beautiful pattern that is working out to perfection. And I saw that every conscious created being has their life path within this plan and that they have free will within the plan. But on the other hand, the free will is sort of an illusion because all that exists is God. All that exists is brilliant light. And so every choice is a choice for God. Everything is ultimately leading back towards love. We have to go into a space where we have the illusion of duality to have free will to make a different choice. But even a choice away from the light will teach us a lesson that will ultimately lead us back towards the light. Aside from that, it's hard to describe because it it was so far beyond our ability to understand. I remember there are a lot of things I saw that I wasn't able to bring back. But after I saw those 2 things, I started contracting back into my head, and I heard music. That's another thing I didn't mention, but this whole entire experience was it's like the experience was music. There's this music playing and everything was happening with the music. It's hard to explain it. But I began floating back into my body on the music, and I remember hearing it really strongly when I was coming back in. I still remember what it sounded like. And I felt all the information that I had gained falling out of my awareness. I felt like I was a balloon losing air, and that information was just falling out of me. I couldn't hold on to it. And I came back in and I like clicked back into place. And then I had the first moment of my ego coming back online, like my self awareness that was able to analyze what had happened. And I thought, what just happened? Because while the experience was happening, I wasn't questioning it or analyzing it. I was just present in the experience. But I came back, I realized something really profound had happened. And then I felt that love, the force field of love stayed with me until I fell asleep. And I felt a glow around me for the next couple of days after the experience happened. And then eventually that faded too. So that's what I remember from my experience.
Oh, wow. Thank you for all that. Yeah. Okay.
Of course. Thank you for asking me to share.
Um, Now that you've had some time away from that and done lots of integration, can you speak to now having this feeling of contrast where you had like such intense bliss and love and remembering, but then also landing here in your body, and what's that been like?
Mm. It's difficult. It's Well, first of all, I could describe a little bit of what the contrast feels like, I guess. It feels almost like being stuck, like so limited, and things that are difficult for me would be like navigating the physical world. Is a very clumsy person. I find it really difficult even to navigate like the boundaries and edges of the physical world, because on that side, as you know, it's not like that. Everything flows and connects. Another thing that's difficult is the boundaries between people, because over there, and I'm getting some of this from my pre-birth memories where some of these things are stronger, but over there, it's like there's no boundaries between beings. You feel each other. It goes even beyond telepathy. It's like you don't even have thought to thought communication. It's feeling to feeling, like being to being. And so that's hard, feeling that distance and boundaries, and you really have to work in this world to connect with people. Communication is really difficult for me because words are so, like, so imprecise and so clumsy. It's like really hard to put being into verbal communication and really get across what you want to share. So those are some things that are difficult for me, um as far as dealing with the contrast. What was your question exactly?
Yeah, no, that pretty much answers it. I was just curious on, like, yeah, what the contrast has been like so far,
Mhm.
but no, that totally answers it. You just mentioned the pre-birth memories, and is there anything that you'd like to share about those?
Sure, yeah, I can share about that. So I mentioned in my near-death like experience that I recognized the being of love, and I recognized it from before my life. So my strongest pre-birth memory is of being in what I describe now as being in the light. And I'm really getting that terminology from near-death experiencers because that's what it's often called, but it's really hard to put language to it because the pre-birth memory didn't happen in a physical realm, and I didn't experience it with my five senses. So the best way that I can describe it is to say that I remember being with the source. I remember being with what I was later taught in religion to call God, but being with the creator and just what that felt like. And it felt like, and again, it's hard to describe because not only do we not have the language for it, but we don't have those feelings in this world either. But the best way that I come up with to describe it is that it felt like being inside a hurricane of love and light. And it's like the combination of the overwhelming, all consuming love combined with the power of like, and this being was like the size of a universe. It was like the size of everything, the immense power that's contained in that. And then the beauty of the creation, because the source is by nature creating. And so I experienced it as if I was in the middle of creation happening. And I experienced like all of these different elements that we experience as separate here, but it was all one thing. So it was like this explosion of light and love that was going out to infinity. And within this light and love, there was music and laughter and color and geometry and beautiful patterns. And it's like it was just flowering open. And it was made up of individual lights, for lack of a better word, because again, it wasn't like I saw a light, but I experienced the essence of it. And these individual beings were singing. It was all music. And if I could translate the music into words, it would be like, we are love, everything is love. Come experience love with us. And it was just this joy that we have no words for or experience of in this world, just complete blissful joy in existence and expression, if that makes sense. So and I remember as a young child how I remembered it was like there was this thing that was out there somewhere that was the answer to every problem on earth. And if I could just feel that and experience that again, it would solve all of my problems. Like it would just wipe my pain away. It would answer all my questions and it would solve all my problems. And so I spent a lot of my early years looking for this because I remembered how blissful it felt and trying to recreate this experience. But that was my strongest memory. I do have, and that one's never left me. I did have other memories that I remembered as a child and that have come back to me later. One of them was that I remember being in a realm of light, and I felt like a very young soul, and I felt like I was there with other young souls. And I don't know if if it's actually because we were all like young beginner souls, or if it's just that's how we all feel on the other side. But I just remember feeling like when I was a child, I called it the Garden of Light. I was with Jesus and the children in the Garden of Light. That's how I perceived it and remembered it as a child. And everything was made of light. Again, like we were all made of light. The garden was made of light. The air was made of light. And it was like these waves of light that would flow into each other. So my light would flow into the air, which would flow into somebody else, which would flow into this other being that I now call Jesus. And I've been questioned on that. It is possible that it's just because I was taught about Jesus as a child, so that's who I identified with. But it was some kind of more powerful being that was really full of joy and would come visit us there and teach us things. And we just loved him so much. And I just remember that he was always laughing and smiling, and he was full of joy and innocence, and everything just felt so joyful and so innocent, to the point where something like that is not accepted in this world. I remember if I would try to talk or share anything about this, it would instantly be shut down like, oh, that's not realistic. That's not how the world is. That's you kind of get the feeling like, oh, that's stupid to think that everybody could be that happy. You know what I mean? So I suppressed it at a really young age, but that's a couple of the things that I remember.
Okay, so I know that you've spoken to so many different people who have had, similar experiences or near-death experiences. And some of them are actually more on the dark side. Like people have really difficult out-of-body near-death experiences. And can you share a little bit about your thoughts on the reason for that, or how that's helped people eventually?
Absolutely. Yeah. The first thing that I've noticed about that, and this is going just off of my experience, and there have been millions of near-death experiences that I haven't read, but in my own experience, a lot of times the hellish experiences that happen are connected to drug experiences. So I wonder sometimes if maybe the drugs are affecting, like putting people into a darker state and then affecting the experience they have. That's definitely not always the case, though. And I think my personal opinion about the hellish experiences is that we do influence the experience that we have through our state of being. So if somebody is in a really dark state of mind, then they could be creating a darker experience on the other side. Again, that's not always the case, but I do think that it happens. Sometimes I think people are given those experiences because it's what they need to have. Maybe they planned it ahead of time. An example would be Howard Storm. He wasn't on drugs, and I don't know if he's necessarily in a dark state of mind, but it's a pretty well-known hellish near-death experience. But it completely changed him having that experience. Do I think that there's a real place called hell that's full of millions of souls that are burning and that they're actually seeing this as a real thing? No, I don't believe that at all, just because the numbers don't line up. The vast majority of people have positive near-death experiences. So where would all of these billions of souls be that are supposedly burning in hell? I think that it is to some extent a creation of the person's consciousness or something that has been put there for them to experience because it's the experience they need to have.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Um, and then going back to, and we'll get into this a little bit in the second half, but how did this, maybe just start to share a little bit about how this changed? You said you grew up in Christianity. How does that experience switch your experience of Christianity, of Jesus, way of looking at that?
Hmm. Yeah, it took me a long time to actually integrate and accept it. So initially after the experience, I went right back into my Christian faith and I tried to seek more experiences within the Christian faith. Even though I knew that what I had been shown in my experience was really contradictory to what I had been taught in Christianity, I just wasn't at a point to be able to accept that. But now, I would say that I think that Christianity is it well, most religions are more of a man-made, human-made path because humans are attempting to seek the divine. I also think that we are given divine revelations that are the foundation of most religions, but then we take those revelations and we institutionalize them, and things change over time. And you really have to get back to the heart of what that religion was. So, in the case of Christianity, I think that the ancient Hebrews were given a divine revelation. And then over time, it got way off track. So, what was that revelation? Well, it could probably be summed up with the Shema, which says, the Lord our God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That's in the Old Testament. But then over time, that gets changed, and all of these um, rules and rituals get added to it. And then Jesus comes along to sort of get things back on track and say, no, actually, we need to get back to the basics of loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. Give it a couple more thousand years, and we're way off track of what Jesus actually taught. So here we are again. And so now we're being given these near-death experiences and these spiritual experiences. They're coming through so many more people now because it's time, I believe, for humanity to awake and to realize that we need to stop fighting about the differences in our religions, and we need to get back to the heart, the truth that's behind all of it, which is all boils down to love and awakening to the fact that we are all one.
Okay, awesome. Thank you for that.